Now, first today, Westminster's agog with speculation this morning that Britain and the EU have pretty much agreed how much the UK should pay the EU to meet ongoing post-Brexit obligations, thereby allowing the Brexit talks to move on to a future trade arrangement in the new year. The actual sum is still a bit vague, with some reports saying it's as high as 60 billion euros, or is that pounds, or as low as 45 billion euros or pounds. Some newspapers this morning are a bit unclear either way. Safe to say, it'll probably be at least double the 20 billion quid Mrs May offered in her Florence speech. Here's Lizzie with the details.
Thanks, Andrew. Well, let's start by talking about our annual contribution to the EU. Last year, that was £9.4 billion, or £181 million per week. Now, Theresa May has long said that the days of Britain making vast contributions to the EU every year will end. But the British government has said in future it may want to make smaller annual payments to participate in EU agencies such as Euratom. Aside from our annual contributions, though, before Brexit, the EU wants to settle the UK's so-called divorce bill. What's included in the bill is contested, but there'll be the UK's share of outstanding commitments from previous EU budgets, pensions for EU officials, and what the EU calls contingent liabilities. Now, in her Florence speech in September, Theresa May promised that no country would lose out from Brexit in the current EU budget round that runs between 2014 and 2020. That was interpreted as meaning that the UK could pay up to 20 billion euros. But she also said that the UK would honour commitments it had made during our membership. And today it's been reported that at last week's meeting of the inner Brexit cabinet, ministers agreed to boost the UK's offer in order to help move talks onto trade. The financial framework that's been said to have been agreed could lead to an eventual bill of between 40 and 50 billion euros. But on this most sensitive of subjects, Downing Street and Brussels are still playing down the idea of a final settlement having been agreed, with just under 3 weeks to go until that crucial meeting of the European Council. Andrew.
Thanks for that. Now, in a minute, we hope to be speaking to Nigel Farage. I think he's in Brussels. We're just beginning to wire him up so we can speak to him. But let's go immediately to Martin Callanan. You are the government minister on Brexit in the Lords.
I am.
So, whatever the sum of money is, let's say it's 40 billion plus. What's it for?
Well, at the moment, Andrew, no sum has been agreed. The Prime Minister was very clear in her Florence speech that we will meet our long-term commitments. It is to settle outstanding liabilities. So these are commitments that the EU has incurred during our period of membership, which last for years, sometimes over decades. Now, there's obviously a detailed argument to be had, and we have Treasury officials in Brussels negotiating this at the moment, going through the long-term commitments line by line to see what is a legal commitment, whether we are responsible for it or for our share of it or not. So there's the detailed, complicated negotiations. There's also, of course, money that we're to get back from our share of capital in the EIB, from our share of Brussels assets, etc. So it's a detailed negotiation, and nothing has yet been agreed.
But 40 billion plus is a lot of money. It's bigger than our defence budget.
It's not all in one lump.
I understand that. It's spread over a number of years.
Yeah.
So give me an idea of what's a big chunk of this 40 billion. After all, it is the people's money who are watching this programme. So give them an idea of where it's going.
Well, a lot of it is to aid for the former Central and Eastern European countries, things like decommissioning nuclear power stations, various structural issues, etc. Things that have been agreed, the spending of which doesn't take place in any one particular year.
So we're going to carry on giving aid to Eastern Europe even after we leave, even though we've got a 12 billion aid budget separate.
Well, that's for poorer countries of the third world. But these are commitments that has been entered into during our period of the membership. And obviously, there's a negotiation going on at the moment. As the Prime
you've
Minister
said that 3 times already. We understand that. But,
but the point is nothing
we
has
are
been agreed
near
yet.
to agreement, though, aren't we?
Well, we have to see. We want to move forward in lockstep together. We want to make sure that, that any agreement in December, we will know in the next few weeks, will take us forward into the important stage, which is the next stage of trade talks.
Now, this is separate from the amount of money that we continue to pay every year until the end of the current budget process, which is 2019.
Yes.
That's correct?
Yes.
So we'll continue to pay the money that we pay.
The long-term MFF, as it's called, is a cap
so this is
of yearly payments. Yeah, that was the initial offer.
Does it cover the transition period?
Well, that is the transition period, effectively, because it's 2 years from 2019.
No, I'm talking about the time. The current budget process ends 2019, the same year as we're coming out.
It doesn't. It ends in 2020.
Well, it's 2019-20. But there's then a transition period that the government wants to negotiate as well. Does this sum of money we're talking about cover the transition period?
Well, the transition period is still to be negotiated, of course. That's what we want to get on to talk about. But I think it's expected that we will meet our budget liabilities during the transition period. Yeah, that was in the first phase of the Florence speech.
So this is an addition then, the 40 billion or wherever it is that's been talked about, is an addition to continuing to pay our budget obligations and to paying the budget during a transition period.
If that is what is agreed in the talks that we haven't had yet. But we want to talk about a transition period. It's very important that we get on to talk about transition period.
No, but there will be a cost on the transition period, and it's not covered by the sums of money talked about today, correct?
Well, I think the Prime Minister said in her speech in Florence that we would meet our obligations during the transition period, yeah.
So, what I'm trying to establish
is that we will carry on
the Minister for this,
terms.
so it's quite important that we get this right. We carry on paying our budget, our membership fee, up until we leave. We then have a transition period of perhaps a couple of years, and then we pay our ongoing obligations. So the point I'm trying to establish is it's 40 billion or whatever, plus the transition period obligations.
No, part of our ongoing long-term commitments will, of course, transpire during the period of our remaining membership and our transition period. And that will be covered under the yearly commitments, payments that are agreed as part of the ongoing normal EU budget process. Sorry, it's a very complicated
well, it is, but it's never really been spelled out for. We'll have to pay another 20 billion in membership fees until it expires, net, 10 billion or so a year. We're then talking about this 40 billion, and we've got the transition period.
But some of that, if that is what is agreed, some of the commitments take place during the remainder of the budget period. They're long-term commitments. So if you're building, I don't know, a bridge or something, and you pay a certain amount per year over the next 10 years, clearly some of that will fall within our remaining membership period and our transition period.
All right, let's go to Nigel Farage now, who's joined us. Then I'll come back to the studio in London, obviously. Nigel Farage, it looks like it's 40 billion pounds or euros plus over a number of years. Isn't that a price worth paying to meet our obligations and get to the end game you've always wanted, which is out of the EU? Well, I guess he didn't hear that. Nigel Farage, can you hear me? It's Andrew Neil here in London. Nigel Farage? Clearly not. Clearly not. We often go live to Beijing, but not to Brussels. This is clearly from. How much would Labour be prepared to pay?
Well, I think the whole point of this debate is exactly the question that you posed, which is, what is this for? What we should have agreed with the EU is what the principles are for generating this sum, because we don't know what it's for. You know, when we're bandying around these amounts.
They have agreed what the obligations are. That's why there's such a range of money being put on it. But it seems that they have agreed our ongoing obligation. Would you be prepared to pay a sum of at least 40 billion?
No, we don't have. We don't have information about what this is for. You said they've agreed, but they've not told anybody else. They haven't told the public. They haven't told Parliament. So how can we make an assessment about whether this is right or not?
If it transpires that our ongoing obligations of the kind that Martin Callanan outlined, if it transpires that they total over 10, 20 years, 40 billion or so, would you be prepared to pay that?
Well, we can't make a judgment until we know what is in those commitments. And that is the problem with this whole debate. We've said from the very start, we wanted the government to negotiate openly with the Commission about which commitments they were going to want to fund. Now, actually, for example, around Euratom, initially, the government said it didn't want to be part of Euratom. Now they seem to have changed on that. We need to know what they're actually saying we should be spending on.
Do you think we should meet our ongoing commitments to regional development in Eastern Europe?
Well, we want to be a responsible country in the world. We want other countries to think that we are. So that would mean potentially looking at some of those areas.
So you would do that?
We don't,
do you think we should continue to meet our pension obligations to the EU?
Well, we don't know under what terms we're being asked to look at that kind of thing. And that is the whole problem. To be fair, we can talk about raw figures until the cows come home. But until we know... No, because the government isn't telling us...
But you know some of the obligations, and you still can't give us any idea of what you would regard as acceptable.
Because we don't know what we're going to be paying for, to be fair. If we knew that, if we had that in front of us, we'd be in a different place. No, because we don't, for example, around the pensions, we don't know what the parameters of that are. We want to look at the detail. This is important. It's taxpayers' money. We want to be able to scrutinise it properly, and we can't do that at the moment because we don't have the methodology that's being used for this. And we've been very consistent about that. We said that from the very start.
Consistent in not giving us any idea of what it would cost. Let me go back to Nigel Farage in Brussels. Nigel Farage, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. Second time lucky. So my question to you was, it looks like we're talking about 40 billion plus in pounds or euros. It's going to be over a long period of time. It's going to meet some of our ongoing obligations even after we leave. Isn't that a sum worth paying to reach the end game you've always wanted, which is to get out?
Well, the first thing to say is we voted to leave and we want a clean break, not a relationship that could go on for possibly decades, certainly in the case of pensions. And secondly, even if we'd been offered tariff-free access to the single market in return, which at this stage we haven't, but even if we had been offered that, it is not worth nearly 50 billion sterling. No deal is better than a bad deal, and this is a very bad deal indeed.
But how do you know that, since most business is terrified at the idea of no deal, of crashing out? Well, they would rather have a deal.
Look, there are lots of different voices of business, and yes, I understand the big corporates, always defend the European Union structure, but I'm reminded they were the same people that thought joining the euro was a good idea.
They're also the people that provide most of our exports, and they're worried that if we crash out, to use the terminology, that it will harm their ability to export. That's legitimate, is it not?
Look,
doing this will avoid that.
Do you know something? With no deal, and with tariffs being put on British manufacturers, the movement of sterling against the euro every month is bigger than the percentage we pay in tariffs. And just look at the amount of business America does, China does with the European Union on World Trade Organization rules. The other big thing here is we keep obsessing about our trade relationship with Europe. Look, 85% of the global economy is outside the Eurozone, and another reason for a very, very clean, quick break is to start opening ourselves up to other trade deals.
Of course. 45% of our exports go to the EU. How much of America's exports go to the EU?
Yeah, these are smaller amounts, but hey, these are growing markets.
How much
and it's
smaller?
Still $300 billion worth.
How much smaller, Nigel Farage?
$300 billion worth every single year the Americans sell into the European single market without having a trade deal of any kind whatsoever.
It's about $1 in 10, whereas for us it's almost 1 in 2. It's much more important, isn't it, to us?
Well, I tell you what, you could look at this the other way around and say that 80% of the entire British economy is not involved in overseas trade of any kind at all. And yet, if we sign up to a transition deal, we're still going to be bound by the rules for the single market. There are lots of advantages to breaking out of this.
OK, well, just finally, what's happened? None of your Tory Eurosceptic friends are saying anything like this. They seem, by and large, to be content to go along with it. Well, why is that?
Well, they've got their big chance. In a few minutes, it's Prime Minister's questions, and I'm hoping somebody on the back benches stands up and says, we did not vote to pay more money to the European Union. We voted to stop paying money, and that this number is unacceptable to the British public. They've got their chance. All
right. Well, we've already heard from some Eurosceptics like Ian Duncan-Smith, who seem reasonably content, but I'm not one to put people off watching PMQs, so no doubt our viewers will follow your rallying cry. Nigel Farage, thank you very much for joining us from Brussels. Martin Callanan, when the Prime Minister spoke in Florence, she said that we were coming to the end of making, quote, vast contributions to the EU. When do we come to this end?
Well, as I said, it's difficult for me to comment in detail until we actually have an agreement. At the moment, officials are there negotiating, as Anneliese said, line by line on the details of the period. And when we have a number, when we have a final agreement, then we can talk about the details then.
Yeah,
but I suppose it depends on what your definition of vast is.
Contributions come to an end is not
a detail. Well, we currently pay
we pay
roughly 10 billion a year ongoing net.
right.
20 billion gross into the EU budget now.
And we've got a transition period and then another 40 billion coming up.
Over many years, possibly even decades.
But it's likely to be front-loaded. So when do the vast contributions come to an end?
It depends on what your definition of vast is, Andrew, doesn't it?
All right, well, at least 10 billion a year.
Well, it's impossible to say at the moment until we have an agreement on the exact amount and going through the details line by line.
Vast contributions, it's not mine. And you keep on referring us to the Florence speech. And yet when we ask about the Florence speech, what does it mean? You can't tell us.
Depends on what the definition of vast
well,
is.
What do you think the Prime Minister
we'll be paying less than we'd be paying for our current contributions.
Well, when the Prime Minister said vast, what did she mean?
It means that we will agree a deal which will provide certainty into the long term, and our payments will be tapering off over the longer term to eventually zero.
Well, that's the first time I've heard vast described like that, but never mind. So you don't want to put any kind of figure on it at all. You won't even talk about what would be right. Can I just clarify then other parts of Labour's position? Is it Labour's position we should remain in the customs union?
Yeah, sorry, on that, on the first bit of your question, we do absolutely want clarity about what this sum is composed, and that is what we're not getting, unfortunately, from government.
All right, well,
around the customs union.
Do you think we should be in the customs union?
So we have said very clearly we want all options to be open to the government. We think they've wrongly said they don't want to stay in a customs union. They don't want to stay in the single market.
If you had the option of staying in the customs union, would you take it?
If that was the best thing for the British economy, along with the other elements of any negotiation, we would be open to looking at it. We have remained open-minded throughout this.
Policy.
No, well, it is, to be fair, because what we've had from the government is we've had months and months of failing to deal with these basic issues.
By February or March,
well, I would hope we would be.
I'm trying to ask you what your position is.
And Andrew, if we were there,
do you still want to be members of the single market?
If we were in a position where we could have a good deal with tariff-free access, where we could keep the same kind of frictionless trading arrangements, we would try and get that.
But do you want to be a member of the single market?
Well, we can't assess that at the moment when we don't know what. Well, because to be fair,
20 members of his front bench for voting to be in the single market.
No, hang on a minute.
All over the place.
No, we're absolutely not. And let's be clear about where we are at the moment in this negotiation. We've just been talking about the exit bill. The government still hasn't sorted out arrangements for EU citizens.
I've already quizzed the government. I'm trying to quiz Labour now. It's only fair that both sides should be quizzed.
Of course.
I'll have one final go. Diane Abbott has called for a referendum on whatever deal is in the end done. Do you agree with that?
Well, I certainly think there needs to be a lot more democracy around the process. How we arrive there is an open question. I think at the moment it would be difficult to envisage how that would fit in with the schedule, how we would make sure that we have a meaningful alternative, if there was a referendum.
I will argue for the right of the electorate to vote on any deal that's finally agreed. Would you argue with that or not?
I think until we know how that would work, I can't argue for it, because I wouldn't know what the other option would be, what the alternative would be if people voted no.
Well, the attempt is the House of Commons vote. But this issue, very briefly, if there are no great trade talks, if trade talks don't produce a good deal, is this money off the table?
Nothing is agreed until everything is agreed.
So it is. That was a shrug there for people who weren't watching the screen.
I mean, we don't want to start. We don't. Nothing is agreed until everything is agreed as a basic principle of negotiations, and we will stick by that.
Close as I can expect to an answer from